Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Shu, Director of Marketing at Christie, and I'm back to host this session of our Cinesparks webinar series. I know we're exactly midway through the month, but first and foremost, I'd still like to wish you all a Happy New Year and thank you for joining. It's my pleasure to moderate this Cinesparks webinar with Dominic Glynn, Senior Scientist at Pixar Animation Studios, who you'll hear from shortly. Many of you have caught the other live sessions already this past October, which are now on our YouTube channel. But for anyone that's new here, the Cinesparks series was created for emerging filmmakers, screenwriters, cinematographers, techs, and engineers as part of Christie's Ignite program to nurture the next generation of talent in cinema, collaborating with industry experts to share trends, skills for you to round out your knowledge. And we hope that you're inspired by their stories and that you find the webinars meaningful as you navigate your cinema careers. So before jumping in, just a few quick things. The webinar is going to be recorded. You can use the chat area, so that's in the bottom there, to talk amongst yourselves. Post your questions for our guest Dominic in the Q&A panel, and we'll answer as many of them at the end. If you like the Cinesparks series, please share the YouTube link with your industry friends and colleagues. So now I'm pleased to introduce Dominic Glynn, Senior Scientist at Pixar Animation Studios, for this session on roles, skills, and applying the scientific method to creating filmmaking as technologies advance while the film is in production.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Dominic, thanks for joining us. We realize how busy you are and this morning, and everyone here really appreciates you taking the time to be here.
This is going to be fun.
All right, so to start things off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey in the industry and maybe your proudest aha moment when you realized this is what you wanted to do?
Okay, well, my path into film, and specifically en route to Pixar, it was somewhat non-conventional, but I think that's a fairly common thing to say. So I'm not entirely sure what conventional is, but I started out in an engineering degree, computer systems engineering. So a lot of math and computer science, physics, and loved the learning so much that I decided to stay at university after I'd sort of ramped up toward the tail of that degree, and I did a master's in engineering after that, with a lot of telecommunications. In particular, a focus on encryption, cryptography. So again, kind of math heavy, satellite comms. And
Okay.
then popped my head up at the end of that process and uh, looked around for what was the most ambitious thing I could do next. That happened to be a role in aerospace, defense, private
Huh.
companies doing that kind of work, which again is a world full of amazing toys, really great collaboration, but it's also the shape of that work often involves long projects, many years in production, and many hundreds of people collaborating toward these fairly coarse deliverables, which is not unlike film, as it turns out. So I took those skills rapidly across to a visual effects company in Australia called Rising Sun Pictures. They had a research arm that I looked after there, which was building software that we couldn't find commercially. So big, monolithic visual effects applications that don't necessarily talk to each other or aren't necessarily malleable to a unique pipeline. All the in-between bits and pieces is what we had to build just to get the shots done there. But it turned out that the pieces that we built there were also quite attractive to other folks in the industry facing the same problems. So we commercialized a lot of those tools. And en route to commercializing some of that stuff and supporting it around the world, I was asked to join a brand new animation company in Canada to help them sort of stand up, bootstrap that. And so we went from single digit employees up to about 300, 350 folks, building all the pipelines from scratch. So the great thing about lacking a precedent in production is that you can explore problems, first principles, and have a clean slate when you approach how to build a pipeline. Toward the tail of that was a lot of the sort of finishing process around color correction and how do we actually get this animated feature into cinemas. And so I wrote some bits and pieces that I published for other folks to see and share. And that's when Pixar came knocking about 6 months before conclusion of that animated feature. They said, "Hey, these are really crazy ideas. Keep doing them, but do them here instead." And so for the last, this is my 20th year now. I've been doing crazy things at Pixar. So unconventional path, but at the same time, a pretty diverse route through a lot of different industries and disciplines.
Now, that's got to be the most interesting story to tell at dinner parties, right? Because no one expects that kind of tangent when someone says, "How did you get to where you are?" Now, when so is that pretty common, right? When someone says, "How do you get to a career path in post production?" Do others that you work alongside of, right, your colleagues and others, is that common for others to get to that point, or are there others that are more
Yeah.
linear getting to those roles?
Yeah, you know what? I think the common thread that I've seen, a pattern emerging, is folks who are high performers necessarily
Hmm.
are exhibiting a lot of flexibility in this particular domain because the 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 ground is shifting all the time. So whilst you may go to school and study a specific technique or a specific application, the one thing we do know is 2, 3, 4 years from now, that's going to be superseded by something more sophisticated, more ambitious, more capable, more efficient. And so I think one of the traits I find common in a lot of the folks that I work with is their malleability, their ability to pivot and adapt. And I
Hmm.
think that's illustrated through my own path. That said, the sort of core understanding and disciplines, the language of cinema is something that can be formally learned to a degree. And I think folks that go through a film school path are going to, take on board a bunch of those atoms that allow them to communicate in a pretty efficient way with many of our filmmakers. Um, but Pixar, for example, is very much science and art together and collaborating.
Hmm.
So I think having an understanding of the other side of that divide, it may not be your core discipline that you studied, but understanding how to hear it, how to communicate, what are the priorities on the other side is absolutely critical to everybody, and that goes for both sides, the science and the art.
Okay. Now, talking about science and art, you did help us write the description of this webinar, right? So, one of the first line that you wrote in this is making movies at scale means that involving the hard sciences is a necessity. Now, that's not something that normally people would associate together. It's a quite thought-provoking, and it's a good opening line coming from a person that's in marketing. Now, what do you mean by that? Right? And if you can provide any concrete examples from films that you've worked on, I think that'd be really good for the listeners in today.
Yeah, absolutely, the hard sciences. Well, I guess my formal schooling, my natural inclination, the thing that I find efficient and exciting, absolutely, is hard science related. So absolutes, finite, testable, quanta that can be repeated, uh, and proven and sort of communicated in a discrete way. So that's what I mean by the hard sciences, which you might think out of the gate is somewhat anathema to the much more typically ephemeral artistic process of, I have an idea, it exists in my mind, I'd love to share that with somebody. How am I going to get it out of here into the broader world? And there's a whole bunch of less finite ways to do that. It's a very flexible process. How can I connect with other people emotionally, with and without language barriers? How can I have a multi sort of stimulus? It's both picture and sound. Um, and so binding these two together, at the scale that some of the large visual effects films, when you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of people working collaboratively on a single deliverable, there is a necessity for, one of the things I mentioned is, repeatability. Can I get back to this place that I am right now? What was involved in getting to this destination? And then being able to iterate
Mhm.
in a somewhat finite manner so that I can test and try new ideas. I think that the title of our chat right now is that every film is an experiment, and truly it is. That out of the gate, we are always attempting to challenge ourselves and to test our assumptions, and I think the result often isn't known until you try it. And for that reason, being able to predict and to measure are critical in giving us more opportunities to iterate. These films for us takes anywhere between 4, 5, 6 years, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Um, but it's important during that process that we're able to refine and finesse. And so being able to iterate over and over and over again, can I try A instead of B? What happens if I try half of A instead of B? And which
Hmm.
of those do I prefer? How do I repeat that? How do I combine that with C and D? So there's very much a scientific method involved in the production process, even though the highest form of our goal, our ambition, is art and emotion.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, in some of the disciplines that I'm lucky enough to touch here, we lean heavily on established um, expertise in many, many fields. If we take, for example, color science, um, there's a mathematical component, so we're leaning a lot on established methods of math. We borrow in that domain from finance. In medicine, we need to understand not just the neuroscience, the physiology, but we also need to understand the physics of, how do I measure light and quantify that, and how do I then uh, use that measurement in a way that results in something deterministic in my artistic process. If it feels too red to me but doesn't feel too red to you, what's going on there? How do we get to the bottom of not who's right, but how we can communicate and see and understand the same message?
Okay. All right. So you say, like sometimes it takes you like 5 to 6 years to get that finesse, right? That's a long outlook, right? So when you have to look that far ahead into the future, and making a movie really does take that long. And from a company like Christie that gets involved in the technologies, and there are technologies that don't exist that far out yet, right? And there are very many aspects to technology. We're talking about technology that has considerations for the development of content, right, on the
Hmm.
content
Hmm.
side of things. And there's also the side of being able to show that content, right? Like on the technology of projection, being able to showcase and how people watch the movies and consume that content. There's both ends of those spectrums. How do you make those considerations when looking at post production and the development
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah. This is both. I mean, this is double edged. It's such a treat to have a broad, wide, open playing field, and at the same time, um, you know, when a film is conceived here and greenlit, our director and the story team have in their mind an expectation of what experience they would hope to share with an audience. But like you said, that sharing moment might be 5 years in the future,
Hmm.
and so part of it comes down to uh, building all of the requisite components of the product in a form that allow them to be bound together very late in the process. So we have this incredible multi-dimensional agility, and this comes down to what is the fidelity of all the assets, what is the sort of, for example, the bit depth of all the textures that are going to be used in some of the surface calculations. How much fidelity could we expect during a render process on that final image, such that we have some agility remaining at the end of the process to say, you know what, there's a new way that we could experience this story. It's 3D, it's immersive sound, it's wider gamuts, different frame rates. There's all manner of dimensions that can play into how that intention is consumed at the
Hmm.
last moment. And so what we have to do is build a great deal of agility into the assets so that it represents our intent with some extra headroom, so that we can pivot, or we can finesse, or we can augment, without having to reimagine how did we build this thing, and how do we carry it through to the final example? So in brass tacks, what that means for us is when we are reviewing all of the work of all the different disciplines that collaborate and feed into each other, there's a very collaborative process. So many specialists who are each contributing something very deliberate and very sort of discreet and accretive to the process. When we look at each one of those components, we kind of say, well, how flexible is it? If we wanted to change it a little bit, will it survive that change without breaking? Does it have the requisite robustness to allow for a little bit of headroom, a little bit of wiggle en route? And so this combination of all these hundreds and thousands of pieces that come together at the last minute, they all have a little bit of agility to them. And we kind of try and ride the center line, if that makes sense. You've got a dartboard with a bullseye in the middle. We're like, okay, my dart can move a little bit. I'm aiming for the center, but if I have to zag left a little, then I've got the ability to do that.
Okay, I see.
I guess thinking further about it as well, a good portion of how we preemptively build in that robustness is also keeping an eye on industry trends. We see preferences in consumption. For an example, in the cinema space, there's an ever-growing trend currently toward what we call premium large format. So you go to the cinema, and there's a bunch of different rooms you can choose, a bunch of different brands you might have some familiarity with. But by and large, there's an increase in the sort of portion of a film's revenue, which is derived from what we call premium large format. So that's the biggest screens and the brightest image and all the resolution and the immersive sound and beautiful seats and a curated experience. But it's kind of it's big cinema. It's event cinema. That's sort of taking an ever increasing share of folks' preference in consumption. What that means for us in real terms is resolution is a very critical element. The bigger you make the screen, the more robust you need to make it from a fidelity perspective, such that it still feels very premium. And so we are finding an ever increasing trend where Pixar's films are now, in some cases, majority 4K rendered native. We're creating just trillions of pixels en route to this final exhibition, because it's responding to an audience's expectations in the cinema, so that it still feels very premium. It feels like it's worth your time to get off the couch, jump in the car, go to this place on time, and experience that big screen event.
Absolutely. Okay, and then would you say, what trends in post-production are you kind of seeing next then, like for the next 5 years, for the emerging talent especially? What would you say to them to get them ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so do try and keep an ear to the ground on the big industry events, by which I would imagine that's like NAB, National Association of Broadcasters. IBC is a International Cinema and Broadcast Conference, and a lot of these folks have a really robust web presence, so you can get a feeling for what are the big announcements at those things. Even CES that just happened in Vegas is a great one for understanding, in the non-theatrical space, for example, where are televisions trending right now? How do they compare to last year's TVs? Are they bigger? Are they brighter? Is there more resolution? Is there something about frame rates that they're doing? And it's not that we pander to all of the sort of the marketing and the buzz on those toys, but we do want to understand preferences and expectations in how our content's going to be consumed. And so that's a great one for folks who are trying to understand, hey, what are the opportunities in the market? What's going to be important to content creators? If I understand something about changing resolution or frame rate, or moving from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range, these are sort of the atoms that we're dealing with every day. And if you can sort of see a trend in some of that stuff, it might allow you to position yourself and say, hey, you know what? There's this project that I've been wanting to try, and it would be perfect to exemplify this technology that's probably going to land in about a year or two. And that would be a real ace up your sleeve to sort of have some experience in actually, get your hands dirty, do the work, and understand where the pitfalls are. Um, uh, I guess trying to reach out and find as many folks as you can, or even scouring places like LinkedIn to sort of see how folks are changing jobs, how they're moving between companies, what are the new roles that folks are excited about. Um, the trends that we have seen, though, by and large, is that there's an ever increasing appetite for personalization in media, uh, and whether that means it's a recommendation engine for what I should watch next, or whether it is something like my streaming platform knows that I love watching French subtitles whenever it's a movie, and so it kind of can offer that to me on a platter. There's a whole bunch of smart things that had to happen, both in terms of gathering the metrics and storing people's IDs and understanding your region and profile detection, and then of course the mechanics of how do I serve up the media and slice it in such a way that it's localized picture with the right audio track, but it kind of matches whichever surround sound system you have at home. This is what I mean by personalization, is that we want to honor and respond to what adds value for our audiences. How can we better serve the experience, not just from a
Hmm.
competitive perspective, so that this service is more personalized than that service, but so that we can remove distractions. In our case, it's like I want you to be immersed in this story. I don't want you to be distracted ever. If you're aware of the fact that it's 4K versus 8K, or that it's Atmos versus 7.1, I would much prefer that you're just like, that was amazing. That story was so
Yeah,
beautiful. It really meant something to me, and I'll remember this forever. It changed my life. That kind of thing, without being too grand about it. The moment you're saying, "Oh wow, the laser was a really fascinating wavelength," it's like, dude, that's not part of the story. That's like, pay
exactly.
attention.
Yeah. So hopefully everyone here's really taking notes on things like that, right? Like that's really what you want to be immersed in, is that story.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And I think you prepared some material. I don't know if you wanted to share any of that right now.
That's a great idea, actually. Yeah, I'll call out to perhaps our helpers behind the scenes to put up a little portion of the Ratatouille movie. This is one of the a moment to sort of give you an example of how we find challenge in stressing our assumptions. So Ratatouille released at a time when we were still doing 35 millimeter film. Getting from the computer to that film image was always, a delicate art. There's a lot of science in that, absolutely. But part of our limits at the time were making assumptions around the fact that we love the color on the computer monitor. Let's just replicate that color on the film, and then we're all good. We don't have to think about it a second time. But what that means is you can't access some of the brightest elements of film because the color on the computer monitor at the time was comparatively cool in the whites, which meant there's a whole bunch of the whites on film that we couldn't get to. So what we did at that time was essentially pivot and say, you know what, let's make them slightly different colors, but in a very deterministic way, so that we can access the bright things on film and heighten that immersion, get you those hot flames with the little rat under the oven. I'm feeling all the heat and the sort of oppression of this environment. It's all about, again, that immersion and that capability to sort of drop you into the story and have that be a really encapsulating experience. Um, so this is a great little example of how we had to do a bunch of science around understanding film and the spectra of light that passes through it, and how to modulate lasers to change the film in such a way that we could access a region of sort of available colors, the gamut, that was previously unavailable to us, all in service of heightening that immersion and that story. Um,
Mm.
there's another little video actually that we have here from Inside Out 2, where again, if we concentrate on color for a moment, in Inside Out 2, the spoilers, there's this object that we manifest called the sense of self, and as it grows from this pedestal, at the climax of the film, it oscillates through a bunch of really intense colors, to represent our protagonist's growth in this domain. Her sense of self is evolving and becoming more complex, and doing things that it was previously unable to. And so, at this moment in the film, we actually ended up exercising a portion of the color palette, that gamut, which is typically unavailable in cinema. So there's a very standardized way that you can calibrate your projector and send image data to the auditorium such that you can access a particular color palette, and it's a very standardized, available set of colors. And what we've done here is to sort of break the rules a little bit and start accessing some colors in certain environments. If you have a laser projector in the cinema, there's actually a broader range of color that's available to be exercised. What we did is to sort of reserve that special superpower just for this moment in the film, so that for the rest of the film, you're watching the movie, it feels like a movie, it speaks movie colors, and it feels very cinematic and theatrical. And then there's this beat, this moment where we really want to heighten the emotion and reinforce how special and how different this object is, and
Starting to
just
see
subtly.
where that science is
Yeah,
applied now. Okay.
absolutely. So the scope on the left, you can kind of see this video scope. Any region of that false color diagram that goes to red is actually showing you a region of the color palette that is outside that traditional cinema. So it's not the whole thing. It's not, a heavy sledgehammer that again would distract you and pull you out of the moment. And for the vast majority of our audience, they may not even notice that it's happening. And that's the goal. In fact, it feels impactful. It feels emotional. There's something extra special. Maybe you can't put your finger on it, but we're doing it very deliberately to differentiate
Hmm.
just this moment in the film. And that's a great example of some of the finesse and subtlety, how we can complement the art using the science.
Hmm.
Thanks for bringing those up. That's great.
That's fantastic. All right. So, guys, we're about halfway into this now. So, as we get into it a little bit further, and before we get to the end of the session, I did want to ask Dominic one more question here before we leave some time for Q&A. So, if you do have questions, make sure that you start adding them into the Q&A panel, and we'll get to them as well as many of them as we can shortly. So, Dominic, one last question from me before we get there. Any advice on how people can start to network, right? So we have a lot of grad students that are going to be on this webinar, and possibly some that are already working in the industry for probably a couple of years, and they're looking for their next big break. So what do you say to them?
Yeah, uh, nothing beats FaceTime. Finding yourself at an industry event or an industry adjacent event and just talking to the people. Of course, the Los Angeles area is the highest density of events for that kind of thing, where you can find your way, around a bunch of folks who are in all manner of disciplines within feature film work or TV work. Um, that said, uh, really getting your hands dirty on some kind of example project. You don't have to necessarily build a portfolio that's polished for handoff to somebody, but actually, downloading the programs, trying them out, having some real world experience with the specific disciplines that you're interested in, I think is a real differentiator. It sort of removes it from the abstract. Um,
Hmm.
and if you are in industry already and looking to make a change, um, at the top of the pile, honestly, is do good work. It's easy to say, but it really makes a difference if you don't have to protect your reputation explicitly every time you're hoping to interact with somebody. If you can rest on that knowledge that um, going above and beyond, outperforming people's expectations is always such an incredible calling card, and it's uh, something that becomes really addictive as well when you collaborate with the A players who exceed your expectations every time. It becomes really energizing, and I think that's what a lot of folks are seeking when they're looking for new hires or looking for someone who may be overlooked. It's like, wow, if I can get so much energy out of this interaction. I can't wait to scale it up. Let's work together, you know.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts before we move on to the Q&A?
Oh goodness, you know, it's just get ready for change. It's always, it's the one thing we know is what's coming next. I don't know. We
Yeah.
try our hardest to predict it every time. It's what keeps us all buzzing and alive and on our toes. And you know, cinema is this century-old language, which is so refined and steeped in so much tradition, and has come from, you know, these potentially haughty places of it's art, and we, you know, absolutely, it is all those things. But from the nerd perspective, it has always been technology as well. You know, from its very inception, it was always like, hey, I have this crazy new idea. No one's ever done it before. Maybe it's really hard. I really hope it surprises you. That's cinema technology, and that is the one constant for the last 100 years is innovation in cinema technology. It's not stopping. And of course, we have this somewhat of an arms race between the home and the cinema now, where my TV is brighter. Well, my projector is brighter. Well, my TV has more channels of sound. Well, my room has 64 channels. You know, it's this gamesmanship of how can I out technology your expectations. All that said, it's always in service of the art. It's not tech for tech's sake. You know, how can it make better art? And that is such a rewarding thing to be amongst, because, you know, speaking firsthand, so many times I'm reminded of this. If our artists, you know, if I can help them make this idea 2% better, this is the world to them. It's like, oh my God, thank you. This is what I always wanted. I was not able to do this before, and you've just, you know, you've delivered beyond my wildest dreams. Now I can convey this idea with so much more impact. It's a really rewarding thing to be around.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dom. So why don't we get into the Q&A portion here? And guys, if we don't get to all of the questions, don't feel bad. All right, we'll go ahead and try. But if we don't, we'll follow up with the answers after the webinar. I'll ask Dominic to try to look through all of the questions, and then we'll get to them, and then we'll answer them in the YouTube answers, and we'll do our best here. So the first question that we have is, what is the correct order, the editing of the narrative locked down, and then all the visual effects added, or do they all happen at the same time?
Yeah. Again, I mean, our process at Pixar is one where we have, you know, anywhere from 4 or 5 movies running in parallel, and many more that are in the queue after those. To sort of boil it down into absolutes, we tend to aim to conclude a film every 9 months here at Pixar. So we kind of, you know, we wrap it, we finish final color correction, we QC the thing and say, yes, that one's great, stick it in the can. All the while, there are another 3, 4, 5 movies running in the background at different stages of maturity. I mention all of that because throughout the process, story is fluid. It's changing. There are elements that are locked. One of the things that we find, though, is the degree of investment in, you know, when we build props, when we build sets, when we animate characters, when we light scenes. In order for us to invest the most into each of those disciplines, we want to ideally have everything that we invest in make it to the final image and have nothing left behind. You know, nothing in the reject bin. That's the perfect world. We're not there yet. And so what that means is that, you know, as the story and the edit change, you know, we can't animate until it's, you know, in a fine sense, until the edit's locked, when we know the first and last frame and when people are speaking, when interactions happen, when simulation has to happen. There's a lot of that is highly dependent on the edit being locked. There are elements, though, that we can preempt before the edit is locked. We can start to, for example, shade and texture and characters. Of course, the modeling of some of the props. If we know what's going to be in camera, then we can model just those props. But again, we need a little bit of agility to account for some of the flexibility. But we can light coarsely some of the scenes before before the edit is locked all the way down. So that it's by degrees, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. And we're still forever attempting to optimize all of that process so that we can invest more in in the final image, in the final pixels, in the final everything.
All right. Second question that I have here. HDR and OBA are great for enhancing the storytelling, but some stories benefit from the opposite. Have you run into this in any recent productions?
Right. So high dynamic range and object-based audio. When we think about constraints, yeah, I mean, a couple things I'll mention. One is, I deal a lot with the directors of photography, the folks who are accountable for the final look of the images that are exhibited, and so they are my artistic right hand. I bring the technology, they bring the art. We sit down together and figure out how are we going to make this image as beautiful as it can be and exactly what we intend. The tool set with which we start that process, we can say, and I often have this analogy where I'll talk about how many crayons do you want to draw your picture. You can have the pack that's got 16 crayons in it, or you can have the pack that's got 32 crayons in it, different colors. I guarantee you, every single one of my DPs is going to say, of course, the 32 crayons. Don't tell me I can't have 16 of these colors. Even if it's a black and white movie, they want the 32 crayons. So agility in the tool set is freeing to a degree or calming to a degree. But the counterpoint here is also that constraints are a forcing function for innovation. And if we think about, in the case of a black and white movie, it necessitates that I think about image structure in a really, really critical way. How can I make sure that the shadow detail illustrates exactly where I want to guide your eye? How can I make sure that there's enough finesse in the highlights to convey the shape or the enormity of this object? So I guess we're greedy when it comes to the tool set. I love object-based audio because it lets me discreetly position the energy in the room. That said, it draws on a different tool set or a different skill set in terms of how can I convey emotion and intent and story. There's a moment in the original Inside Out film where the protagonist's joy and sadness end up in this set that we call abstract thought. And all the geometry goes crazy for a moment. It's supposed to be quite an abstraction of the ideas of shape and color. And throughout that process, our characters go from this beautiful, rich fidelity, highly, wonderfully lit and lots of simulation, and then they become very polygonal. And then after that, they become kind of 2D and flat, and then they turn into one-dimensional lines at the end of it. And throughout that process, we're not just sort of collapsing the visual field, but to complement it, we collapse the audio field as well. So it starts off Atmos and it's full object-based audio, and by the end of the process, it's a mono soundtrack. So we kind of we lean in hard to exactly that set of dimensions in fidelity and agility of the art. So sometimes the new toys can be a distraction as well. It's worth saying. Every time there's a new technology, we have to learn it. We have to integrate it into the art, into the language. And that's not just from the content creator's perspective, but that's also from the audience's perspective. If we bring them something radically new, we should expect there is a potential for some pushback. We don't want to turn it up to 11 just because we can. We want to be sensitive and finesse and sort of introduce people to this thing in a way that can be integrated into their expectations a little bit, unless in the case of the color example that I gave before with Inside Out 2, we did something quite aggressive on the original Inside Out film, where similarly we exercised all these colors that were well outside cinema tradition, but in that moment we wanted it to be a stark departure from expectations. We wanted it to be shocking and jarring because it complemented the story in a way that was just really beautiful. The characters were headed toward the subconscious set, which is conveyed as, all the deepest, darkest fears of our character, and we wanted our audience to understand how unnatural it was for the characters in the film, how much they were out of their element, how uncertain they were about expectations. So constrained for this moment, it complemented the narrative beautifully, but perhaps was a very aggressive example of how we can depart from some of those traditions.
Okay. All right. Next question. When working on Ratatouille, did the experimentation with the translation of light to 35 millimeter, is this something that prolonged the production? And how do you personally predict production times when the science hasn't been done before?
Great questions. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there's, as mentioned, many hundreds of folks collaborating on this single deliverable of a movie. It's a risky thing to do. 350 people, hey, let's make meaningful eye contact and say, we're doing this together, right? Okay, great. And we promised our audience a release date, June 17th, whatever it happens to be. On this date, the audience will be able to see the thing we promised. We build an enormously complex and interdependent project schedule around that, where each of the disciplines has its interdependencies linked. Prerequisites for this must feed into this. So there's a Rube Goldberg machine almost of complex little pieces that all feed into each other in sequence serially, but in a collaborative way. And part of that is a lot of the experimentation around the finishing process and exhibition. So in the case of the film experiments, we had an optics lab. We had built a bunch of machines for scanning film and for interrogating it in a way that we couldn't essentially lean on industry or our suppliers for some of the information. So we kind of had to first principles this one. But we did all of that with the expectation that we're looking over the horizon for this release date in order for us to make these decisions. How far do we have to backtrack it to be certain that it's going to work? When we're all doing our jobs well, it works just like I described. We preempt everything and we planned it wonderfully, and it all lands on time. There are occasions where some of these ideas are super late breaking, and behind the scenes, it only comes together with days to spare, on occasion with hours to spare. So there's a lot of ambition. We're so driven to sort of plus this experience, to augment it and make it as beautiful as possible. It's really hard to put pencils down and say, okay, I'm not going to touch it anymore, we're finished. We can always make it better. So it didn't delay production in the case of Rat, but it wasn't a thing that we knew we could do when we started the film. It was a hypothesis, and it relied on a lot of trust between the director of photography and the colorist, where we were honestly asking her to link arms with us and let's try something that we've never done before. We think it can add value. We think it can give you these options. We think it can make it beautiful. Would you be willing to try that with us? And that trust takes a while to build up. Each of these disciplines are so complex and risky on their own. But when you have, again, A players collaborating, it becomes really energizing to try it, again, to make that meaningful eye contact and say, let's do this thing. I think it can work. Of course, mitigations for fallback. We have other options in our back pocket all the time to make sure that we're not going to have a dark screen on release day. But there's always this ambition to reach higher. And I forget the second half of your question there. I'm so sorry.
It says, and how do you personally predict production times when the science hasn't been done before?
Yeah. There's a lot of it that comes down to, again, hard sciences that you can run metrics on. Can I measure render times? Can I measure throughput times and transfer? And can I guarantee that I'll have these hard resources available for this period? It's almost like you're renting time inside the building on a shared on a shared resource. We have a render farm here where we have more than 100,000 cores on this compute cluster that allows us to do a lot of the final image generation. But that's a shared resource amongst all the different films that are running. The film that is next in the queue has the lion's share of compute available to them, and that's all based on predictive models of what's the complexity of the images, how many images do you have, how many different language versions do we need, is there a stereoscopic version that needs to come along, when are we going to do the 4K version of it. So all of these things feed in from a metrics perspective and prediction. And then there's also an element of everything is always on fire all the time. How quickly can I put the fire out? And that's where it comes down to experience and communication. And I've seen a disaster of this shape before. I know that 3 days from now I should know these things about it, and I'll have these people available to help me to solve it. So it's a very dynamic environment. A lot of it comes down to communication, gut feel, experience. And then the other half is very much hard sciences, metrics, predictions, write down your intent and make sure you do what you promised, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. What are your thoughts on the impact of HFR, so high frame rate content?
Yeah, as mentioned, the technology of cinema has always been a driving force of what's next in storytelling. This technology capability has arrived over here. Now we have the ability to tell stories this way, whereas previously we didn't. And I think HFR, high frame rate, is absolutely one of these dimensions. That century of cinema legacy inherently has evolved with what I will call low frame rate exhibition. Today, the vast majority of films are exhibited at 24 frames per second. There's, intrinsically bound in the cinema experience to date has been this expectation of 24 frames per second. 99% of folks in the cinema are unaware that the frame rate is a specific thing, or that a low frame rate is part of the cinema experience. But there are elements of that exhibition which we're still trying to understand in terms of the perception, the sort of the neuroscience and the cognitive elements of it. If you've ever had the privilege of seeing a film at both 24 frames per second and an alternate frame rate, whether that's 48 or 60, they can be quite different experiences, even though the sound mix is the same, it's the same brightness. If the only thing that changes is the frame rate, it can still be quite a stark difference from your perception, even though it's the same set and the same lighting and the same actors and the same effects, well, with extra frames. So some folks are a little distracted today by frame rates other than 24 in cinema. I, speaking very personally about it, I think there are a lot of mechanical elements of high frame rate which are exciting from both a creative perspective and from a comfort perspective. And I think, like fresh technologies, we're still trying to understand how best to exploit this in a way which is accretive to the experience, that which adds value, which complements and augments the experience. Part of that as well, I think, is the experience on the content creation side. Like I said, turning everything up to 11 can sometimes be a little distracting. Not to suggest that that's the way it has been done or will be done anytime in the near future, but I think it demands a really deliberate finesse today in cinema, such that it is not the most observable thing about the exhibition. Like I said, I'm excited for where it can go and how it can be used in the service of the art. And the mechanical elements, like I mentioned, 24 frames per second is not enough information for your brain when it comes down to surviving in the world optimally. And so in a cinema experience, the absence of information between those 24 frames, our mind, our brain uh, interpolates, synthesizes, fills in the information that it's not presented. The moment you ratchet that frame rate up to something really high, 96, for example, that's all the information you need. Your brain is like, okay, I'm full. You've told me everything I need to know. Nothing is left open to interpretation. And the in-between stuff, something is left open to interpretation, and part of that is the cinema experience. As it turns out, it's part of the language that we've learned. It's totally subconscious, but part of what feels like cinema. So it's, there's a transition period. We're not there yet. We're on the path. Some filmmakers are very aggressively pushing that, and we are so grateful that they are willing to step forward and run some of those big risky experiments out in the open.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question here. If cinema is an ancient language and art form, how do you anticipate it evolving in the near term? And does it need to evolve beyond the technology enabling it?
Yeah, I mean, folks are watching stories today, a lot on YouTube, maybe on their back, in bed, on their phone. There's a lot of media consumption that happens in ways that are not the big screen. Um, you know, uh, we're storytellers. That's one of the things that we think we're pretty good at is telling stories. The technologies en route to conveying the story, I think, are somewhat of a secondary element from a long-term strategic perspective. We need to remain agile. We need to be open to it. We need to be responsive to technology. We also need to be um, forward-leaning in guiding technology, and that's a lot of what I do here at Pixar, is to sort of help the industry proper better position itself to be scalable, sustainable, efficient, high fidelity, interoperable. Um, in terms of cinema, though, and the language of cinema, um, I think I think we have a really diverse slate of storytellers in terms of their experience, uh, and also now their age, and I think that is playing into how we approach the type, the style, the content of stories that we want to tell. Um, so I think it's two-way. That the industry is evolving, the platform is evolving, but we're evolving too as storytellers, and that's not just here. I think uh, we're seeing a lot of new ideas emerge in different modes of storytelling than the big screen, and those are exciting too. I spoke about making cinema more personalized. Um, we're on the cusp, a threshold of technological enablement that allows cinema to be hyper personalized per frame. Um, what does that mean for storytelling? What if we both sit down to experience the latest blockbuster, and we're each fed a different set of frames? What does that mean from an experience perspective? We each loved it. We each thought it tugged at our heartstrings. It spoke to something personal to us, but we saw different stories. I don't know where that's going to go, but I'm excited for how we can make it amazing.
Okay. All right. We are getting close to the end of the hour here. I think we can squeeze in maybe another question. Uh, what percentage of Pixar movies or movies in general don't ever make it to the big screen?
Oh boy, movies. Yeah. Um, we have so many ideas. Um, there are so many untold stories in the industry. Not just Pixar. I mean, just if only there were more hours in the day, we could tell all the stories. Is what it comes down to. So I think, you know, I was looking through. It's awards season right now for cinema. Folks are looking through all the different films they're in contention for various awards at the different guilds. Um, my God, there's so much beautiful art out there, and it's all um, really deliberate and unique, and um, it's a large percentage is what it comes down to of ideas that never make it to the big screen. Um, yeah, I don't know how we can make that better. Consumption is huge, of course, as mentioned. Though, like you're seeing a lot of consumption on different modes of entertainment that aren't linear narrative storytelling. So so we have to be dynamic to that too. But yeah, it's a lot.
Okay. Think I can squeeze in just one more question. Last question is 3D dead?
It is not. There are particular markets that still have a voracious appetite for stereoscopic exhibition. Um, it's not everywhere, and it's not for all people. And I think um, giving our audience the choice, for the folks that love it, they tend to really love it. And so we want to honor that and want to make sure that that's the highest quality product that it can be. So for us, it's still an important element of how we tell our stories in particular markets and particular formats. Yeah.
Okay. So, guys, I think there are a couple other lingering questions. We'll try to get to them, but we are coming to the end of the hour here. So, I would like to wrap up the session and just kind of thank everyone for joining us today. So, Dominic, it is a pleasure to spend the hour with you. And thanks for being with us today, sharing the insights on the world of post production, answering a lot of the questions that everyone had, my questions as well. So everyone, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to check out our YouTube Cinesparks playlist for all the webinars that you may have missed. Thanks for joining all the previous sessions with us already. And have a great day today and happy 2025. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.